Welcome to Lesson 3 of the Reliability of the New Testament. Today we will be examining the history of the Bible in English, and for me personally, I find this lesson probably the most interesting of all of them. All of them are interesting to me, but the history of the Bible in English is a fascinating subject, and so understanding its history, especially for English-speaking people, is just appreciative to the church for what they have done for us. So, brief review before we get into this. Lines of transmission. Hopefully you remember this slide from previous weeks. This is simply explaining that there are multiple lines of transmission that happen with the New Testament books. As a letter was sent, it was copied by multiple different churches and multiple people. And so these different lines start coming into being. And so if there's an error in one line, you can start to examine it by looking at the other lines, and usually you can easily determine what the original reading was. And as these readings are examined, what starts to arise are called text types. What is a text type? Well, we talked about this last week. A group of manuscripts that have a consistent pattern of readings. Generally, they have geographical groupings. And these patterns of readings are not completely different Bibles. We're talking about at places where there are variants in the manuscript tradition. Some families go this way, some families go another way, and so you group those by usually their geographical distribution. So as you see these different text types, I have 3 listed here on the screen: Western, Byzantine, and Alexandrian. Technically there are more, but for sake of simplicity, we'll keep it to these 3. In fact, if we wanted to make it really simple, we can just compare the Alexandrian with the Byzantine, because generally the conversation between text type is had between those 2 groups. So these are the text types that exist. And then this leads us into the Reformation text type. The Reformation text was largely Byzantine in flavor, and why is that? In 1454, the Turks invaded Byzantium, resulting in many monks fleeing to the west, bringing their manuscripts over just in time for the Reformation. And this is important to understand because, once again, as we have reiterated, hopefully not to the point of ad nauseum, the Bible and the manuscript tradition exist in history. The Bible is a historical document. Understanding its history is important. And so as these monks flee, they come over in 1453. What happens in 1454? The advent of the printing press. So all of these Byzantine manuscripts are coming over. But for sake of just the appreciation of Christianity, all these Bibles are coming over. And then you have the invention of the printing press, which is coming soon, which is going to result in the mass production of Bibles. And then you also have, in 1517, Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the door in Wittenberg. Additionally, and this is important to understand, the Renaissance was just about to take place. What is the importance of the Renaissance? Well, in the Renaissance, people started wanting to get back to the original languages instead of reading translations. Remember, the Latin Vulgate is king in the West, and so the original language of Greek wasn't something that was read that much. But as these monks flee, they're bringing their Greek manuscripts. People are wanting to get back to Greek, and there is the advent of the printing press. This is the perfect storm for a Reformation in Europe. And now we come to one of the most interesting people that you have never heard of, Lorenzo Valla. I have asked several people, even people who know history, and almost no one knows of Lorenzo Valla. What is Lorenzo Valla's importance? Why are we talking about him in this conversation of the reliability of the New Testament? Well, as you can see, he lived between 1407 and 1457, and he was a literary critic from Italy. And Lorenzo Valla he really was one of the people who almost originated some of our principles of textual criticism that we still use today. Lorenzo Valla, as he was reading the Latin Vulgate, had the thought that the Latin Vulgate, over time, due to the fact that it has been copied, remember, manuscripts, the printing press is invented in Valla's lifetime, and even when after the printing press was invented, many people didn't use it because they didn't think it was going to catch on. Obviously, it did catch on. But Lorenzo Valla was considering the fact that Jerome's commentaries would have been copied fewer times than the Latin Vulgate itself. Now, why is that important? It's important because the Latin Vulgate had been copied so many times, not changed intentionally, but as scribes copy documents, they make errors. And due to the fact that the Vulgate itself has been copied so many times, the commentaries of Jerome that include the text of the Latin Vulgate would have been copied fewer times than the Vulgate itself, and thus, if you want to see if there is corruption in the Latin Vulgate, if you check the commentaries, then you will have a better idea due to the fact that they were copied fewer times. And so Valla did. He checked Jerome's commentaries and compared the text in the commentary with the text in the Latin Vulgate itself. And he started realizing that yes, indeed, the Latin Vulgate had been corrupted over time. Not intentional corruptions, not things that people were nefariously doing, just basic, understandable, scribal errors. This is, once again, a reiteration. As he checks Jerome's commentary on the Vulgate, because think, a biblical commentary has the text of the Bible in it. And so he checks the commentary. It hasn't been copied as many times. Oh, look. Here are some variations between the text of the Vulgate that we're using today and Jerome's commentary. Jerome's commentary goes back older. And so Valla starts understanding that the older you go back, the more reliable you can find in terms of what the original text said. And so Valla decides to write this all down. He writes it in some books, slams it in a library, never publishes it, and never tells anyone. He never tells anyone. Why is this? Valla, why didn't you come forward with your discovery that the Latin Vulgate is indeed corrupted? Well, back in Valla's time, if you wanted to bring an accusation against the Latin Vulgate, it is likely that you may have become a Human Torch. The Roman Catholic Church was not interested in anyone questioning the liturgical text of their time. And so if you were to say, hey, look, the Latin Vulgate has been corrupted, that is going to get you in some deep water with the church, to say the least, and possibly even killed. So, brilliant man. I love these men who are able to span millennia, who can think outside of their own time period, and can understand, though everything is manuscripted at this time, he still knows that, yeah, there's going to be variation, and the older we go back, the more reliable we can get. And so Valla, I would say he planted a seed, but I'll say that he created a seed, although he's not technically the origin of it. He created a seed that later someone else decided to water and hatch. And who is this someone else? None other than Desiderius Erasmus. Now, if you haven't heard of Lorenzo Valla, it's likely that you have heard of Erasmus, who was influenced by Valla. So who was Erasmus? He was a humanist. Now, just to be clear, humanist back in Reformation time period didn't carry with it the same negative connotations that we think of humanists with today. A humanist simply meant that he wanted to get back to the original languages. He was a scholar, a Roman Catholic scholar, and he was the best scholar in Europe in the 16th century. A notable thing that he did is he debated Martin Luther. He wrote against Martin Luther, or I should say Martin Luther wrote against him when Martin Luther wrote his Bondage of the Will. And that interaction is obviously worth reading, but isn't really related to our topic today. He created the first 5 editions of the Textus Receptus using Greek manuscripts, and he used textual criticism. Okay, so what does all that mean? Well, Desiderius Erasmus one day was scrounging around in a library, and he stumbled across the work of none other than our good friend Lorenzo Valla. And as he starts reading Valla's work, he realizes that yes, indeed, Valla is correct. The Vulgate has been corrupted. And so Erasmus gets the irascible idea of creating a new version of the Latin Vulgate, an updated version of the Latin Vulgate. He also publishes Lorenzo Valla's work, which was bold. It's maybe he thought that due to the fact that it wasn't technically his writing, it was someone else, that it would get him off the hook. It was a dangerous thing to do, but Erasmus was a respected man and was able to do it. And so Erasmus wanted to update the Latin Vulgate. And this man is a brilliant scholar. He learned Greek at age 31. A lot of people have finished their learning at 31, but Erasmus doesn't stop. And so as he decides that he needs to come up with this new edition of the Latin Vulgate, he moves to Basel, Switzerland, and he starts his work there. And what he starts creating is called the Textus Receptus. Now, the Textus Receptus, Erasmus was originally simply in Latin. Or I should say, maybe not originally in Latin, but his primary focus was his Latin. But he decided that he would make it a diglot. Now, what is a diglot? A diglot is where one side of the page has the Latin text and the other side has the Greek text. A diglot is just two languages in the same book. And so you have the Latin text for the Latin Vulgate. This is Erasmus' updated text. And on the other side of the page, you have the Greek text. So you have both Greek and Latin that are being compiled in this new Textus Receptus. What does Textus Receptus mean? It's simply a Latin way of saying received text. This is actually an advertising blurb. It's not that the church had received this text simply throughout the course of human history. It is simply an advertising blurb that was trying to sell more Textus Receptuses. And so he begins this work. He begins this work of creating a new Bible in Latin that also has the Greek text along with it. And people were upset about this. They didn't think that the Latin Vulgate needed to be updated. They didn't think they needed to get back to the Greek. We have the Bible of the Church. It's been established for 1,100 years. What are you doing, Erasmus? We don't need an updated version. But Erasmus decided to update it. And for his Greek text, and primarily we're more concerned about Erasmus' Greek text than his Latin text, because historically that's the one that gained traction, was the Greek text over the Latin text. Which is obvious, because the Greek is the original language. Why would you be interested in a translation when the original language is right there next to it? And so in 1516, he ended up printing and publishing the first Greek New Testament in English. Now, I jumped slightly ahead. As he is working on this, he has about 7 manuscripts, and the earliest Greek manuscript that he is using is from the 11th century. So Erasmus has very limited resources, but you got to remember that people in Reformation time period weren't thinking in terms of text types. They weren't thinking in terms of Byzantine family or Alexandrian family. They're simply using the Bibles that are in front of them. And they're using reliable works. Once again, this is not a criticism of the Byzantine text. Erasmus has Byzantine text in front of him, and so he is working from Byzantine text. So he uses roughly 7 manuscripts. And from these 7 manuscripts, he makes choices between them due to the fact that there are textual variants in the manuscripts. Erasmus himself did textual criticism. The TR was compiled using the methods of textual criticism, some of which we still use today. And so, he gets his first Greek text printed and published. Now, his text was not the first printed Greek text, but it was the first printed and published Greek text. Now, in our modern context, if something is printed, it is almost always simultaneously published. So how could something be printed before Erasmus but not published before Erasmus? Well, Cardinal Ximenes had written the Complutensian Polyglot, which was an impressive work. It was probably a higher quality than Erasmus' first Textus Receptus. But the problem was, back in this time, if you wanted to publish anything, you had to get papal approval. And so there's a backup in the Vatican of things that the Pope needs to approve. And Erasmus is trying to beat the Complutensian Polyglot to publish. And so, though the Complutensian Polyglot exists, it's not published yet. And so Erasmus figures, and specifically Erasmus' printer, John Froben, thinks that, yeah, we have to get this published before the Complutensian Polyglot, because we want ours to catch on first. We know how it works. The first one to market is oftentimes the most popular. And so Erasmus is trying to figure out, how do we get around the fact that we need papal approval? We are behind the polyglot in terms of the waiting list. So how do we get ours to print? Well, Erasmus does the unthinkable. Erasmus prints it, he publishes it, and he dedicates his first edition to the Pope himself, in hopes that the Pope will have compassion on the work and will smile upon it and not decide to bring down any charges of insubordination or whatever it is that they would accuse him of. And it worked. It worked. The Pope turned a blind eye to the Textus Receptus, and Erasmus was good to go. However, he did come under fire because people liked the Latin Vulgate. And now, not only is the Greek there, but the Latin Vulgate has been updated, and their traditional text has been changed. They didn't want their traditional text to be changed. This text itself was in Erasmus' words, thrown together rather than edited, or another way of saying that was precipitated rather than edited. Erasmus was in a rush. Erasmus needed to get it to print. And going forward, we're going to look at some of the specific errors that Erasmus made. This is not a criticism of Erasmus. It is simply understanding the history behind the Textus Receptus. One other thing I'd like to note before we move on to our next reformer. Martin Luther, as he was reading the Textus Receptus, reads Penitentiam Agitae in the Latin, because remember, it's a diglot. He sees Penitentiam Agitae, which means do penance. That's the Latin. And then he looks over on the Greek side, and he sees the Greek word is metanoiete. And Martin Luther starts to realize, as he is examining the Greek next to the Latin, that the Greek is really what is inspired, and the Latin is simply a translation. And there's a big difference in Roman Catholic theology between being repentant and doing penance. And so this getting back to the original language is starting to undercut the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And Erasmus was a man who, though he was a Roman Catholic, ended up playing a big part in that. And that moves us on to one of my favorite reformers, William Tyndale. William Tyndale, for those who speak English and read the Bible, should be somebody that we all appreciate, someone we all respect, someone we all love. He is known as the father of the English Reformation. He was born in England and he lived between 1494 and 1536. And he translated from Erasmus' third edition of the TR. He produced 3 editions of the New Testament. William Tyndale was a Reformed theologian. He could speak 8 languages. He was a scholar of the paramount order. Really, he deserves an entire lecture in and of itself. But William Tyndale, probably the most popular William Tyndale quote, and my favorite William Tyndale quote, he was debating, not a formal debate, an informal conversation, with a Roman Catholic prelate. And William Tyndale was convinced that everyone needed to read the Bible because God's laws were important. And the Roman Catholic prelate was talking to Tyndale and saying that the Pope is what is important. The Pope has the law, and if it really came down to it, he would rather have the Pope's laws than God's laws. And Tyndale responded to this Roman Catholic prelate, and he said this, I defy the Pope and all his laws, and if God spare my life ere many years, I will cause the boy that driveth the plough to know more Scripture than thou dost. And so he was a bold man. A man of conviction, a man who believed that the Bible was important and that people needed to know it. And he believed that the Bible was essential for not only the clergy, but also the laity, the common people, the boy that drives the plow. He wanted to know the Scripture. And that almost became his motto for his life, his mission statement. He wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible. And so King Henry is on the throne in England at this time. And in 1401, Parliament had passed legislation. The legislation was that teaching or reading or having any kind of the Bible in English could get you burned at the stake. There was one individual who had a copy of the Lord's Prayer in English, and he had been burned at the stake. Now, to be burned for simply owning a copy of the Lord's Prayer to us seems ridiculous. But this is high treason in a country where there is no separation of church and state, and the church has determined that Latin is the language that the Bible must be read in and must exist in. Everything was in Latin for the Bible, and the people largely could not speak Latin, and so they were reliant on what their priests and clergymen told them about the Scriptures. Well, obviously, for William Tyndale, that wasn't going to work. He fled to the continent to translate the Bible. He actually went to Germany. He spent time in Wittenberg, probably met Martin Luther. He had already sought approval from the authorities to be able to translate his Bible into English. However, they had none of it. They rejected him. So he tried to seek legal means to do this, but he was denied. And so as he flees to the continent, he starts this work, and it's an independent work that he's doing with a few other people, but he doesn't obviously have the budget that he would have if he was backed by a governing authority. And so if Tyndale had been caught, or if his printer had been caught, almost certainly his printer would have been executed. So there are people who are helping William Tyndale who are really putting their necks on the line too. They believe in this work as well. And so in 1526, Tyndale gets his first New Testament published. It was a small Bible, a pocket Bible. It was a Bible that you were supposed to be able to carry in your pocket, a Bible that you could hide without getting caught with. And they were smuggled into England. And obviously, the Roman Catholic Church gets wind of the fact that these Bibles are coming into England, and they are in English. This is a huge problem for the Roman Catholic Church. And so they start buying up some of these Bibles. And as they're buying the Bibles, they're burning them, because you can't have the Bible in English permeating the country of England. That's going to undercut the governing authorities who are saying that only Latin can be the Bible. And so as these Bibles are getting burned, this money, through a course of events, God's sovereign hand is obviously at work in this, trickles back to William Tyndale. And the money that is spent by the Roman Catholic Church to burn these Bibles actually end up funding Tyndale's second and third editions of the Bible. And so a wonderful man who did this amazing work. There are two tragedies in Tyndale's life. Actually, there are more than two. But one is, as he was fleeing, his printer had gotten discovered. One of the people who had been working alongside the printer ended up getting a little bit drunk, ended up giving a little too much information, and so the publishing house got raided, and Tyndale, fortunately, had understood that they were going to get raided, and so he fled. He gathered up his material for the Old Testament, because remember, he's been working on New Testament, but he switched over to the Old Testament after he had finished the New Testament, and he flees. He gets on a boat and flees. Unfortunately, the ship ends up getting wrecked, and he loses the first 5 books of his Old Testament translation: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Well, that would be a devastating blow to any common person, but William Tyndale is not a common person. William Tyndale decides that he's going to restart the work, and he also determined and understood as he studied further that he had made some errors in his first edition of the Old Testament, and he was thankful that they got destroyed because he was able to actually improve upon that. William Tyndale, what a wonderful person. Well, through a sordid course of events, William Tyndale ends up getting double-crossed and betrayed by somebody who was close to him, and he was taken into captivity and eventually ended up being killed. A lot of people believe Tyndale was burned at the stake. He was not, in fact, killed by burning. He was killed by strangulation. So they strangled him first and then burnt him at the stake. So technically he was dead before fire ever touched his body. Not that that is much of a saving grace. Both are terrible ways to die, but it is worth noting. William Tyndale's final prayer was, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And that prayer would be answered, not necessarily in the salvation of the king, but in the fact that the king then actually allowed English Bibles to be printed and published and preached in the English language. And some variants change depending on who you're asking, but it is estimated that around 84% of the King James Bible is translated directly from William Tyndale's work. So if you're reading your King James Bible, you're almost always going to be reading the words and the translation of William Tyndale. An excellent man, and he deserves our appreciation and adoration. And this leads us to the history of the Bible in English, specifically the Bibles that came before the King James Bible. Now, this is one of the things that not every King James only advocate will throw out, but some of them will say, well, the King James Bible was the first Bible in English. That's just historically inaccurate. The first Bible in English was in 1382. That was John Wycliffe's Bible. Now, John Wycliffe is known as the Morning Star of the Reformation, and he was a scholar in England. His Bible translation, however, didn't come from Greek. It came from the Latin Vulgate. And this is before the advent of the printing press. So all of the Wycliffe Bibles were hand-copied Bibles. What came after the Wycliffe Bible was Tyndale's Bible, which we have discussed. His 1526 edition, which was the New Testament. Now, just to be clear, after Tyndale's translation, every Bible in English is heavily reliant on Tyndale's translational work. So just because there are other Bibles, a lot of them are revisions of Tyndale's work. After Tyndale, you have the Coverdale Bible in 1535. This is an improvement of Tyndale's Bible, and this is one where people started realizing that the Crown's not really going to crack down on the Bible in English. After that, you have the Matthews Bible. This Bible was done by John Rogers, who was a close associate with William Tyndale while he was alive. John Rogers was actually the first Marian martyr in England, but he was able to get his Bible published. And then you have the first authorized Bible, the Great Bible, in 1539. And this is notable because this was authorized by the Crown. Then you have, after the Great Bible, the Geneva Bible in 1557. Now, this Bible came into play because English scholars had fled the Marian persecution that was taking place in England, and they had fled to Geneva. And as Geneva starts being overrun or infiltrated, although those sounds like negative terms, they just English people start coming into Geneva, and so they realize that, yeah, we need a Bible for the people here. So there's a Bible translated into English that is called the Geneva Bible. This is actually the Bible that the Pilgrims loved. The Pilgrims weren't really a fan of the King James Bible. They were a fan of the Geneva Bible. They appreciated the footnotes. It was almost the first study Bible in English. After the Geneva Bible, there was the Bishop's Bible. This is another authorized Bible that was done in 1568. And so there are 7 Bibles right there. Which Bible is conspicuously absent? The Bible that comes next, which is the 1611 King James Bible. So here we have it, the third Bible authorized in English. There were 3 different committees that came together to help translate this Bible. The Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster Committee. And these committees used 7 editions of the Textus Receptus. Now, you might be saying, well, wasn't Erasmus the only person to work on the Textus Receptus? Well, Erasmus was the first Textus Receptus. He was actually the first 5. He made his first one in 1516 and then made improvements to it all the way up until 1533. After 1533, Stephanus made another improvement and published his in 1550, and then Beza made another improvement, 1565, and then actually after that there were even more improvements that were made. However, these are the 7 editions that underlie the Greek text of the 1611 King James Bible. And this is important to know because they were pulling from printed texts. The King James is not translated from a manuscript, because a manuscript is by definition something that is handwritten. It was translated from printed editions of the Greek text, and these Greek texts came from Erasmus' 7 existing Byzantine manuscripts. So what the King James Bible's underlying Greek text is simply the 7 Greek manuscripts and the decisions that Erasmus made to compile into his first TR, and then that went through later editions. But still, we're talking between 7 and 12 Byzantine manuscripts, none of which go back past the year 1000. So they're earlier manuscripts, and they are the underlying force of the King James Bible. And just to be clear, the translators of the King James Bible didn't use just the Greek alone, although that is the obviously underlying text. They were also reliant on Latin and other translations just because sometimes if you are more familiar with another language, it can help you render something into English. But their Greek underlying text were the 7 editions of the TR. And these editions of the TR don't agree with each other identically. There are changes between each edition. Each edition, to a certain degree, is somewhat unique. And now we come to the topic of footnotes in the King James Bible. We need to pay attention to footnotes because the King James Version in 1611 contained footnotes indicating textual variants in the manuscripts. Here on the screen, I have 4 examples of this. You see the second example. This, verse 36, is wanting in most of the Greek copies. Illustration number 3. Many Greek copies add the word, and turning to his disciples, he said. And then also you have the 4th example. Many Greek copies have gave thanks. The King James translators understood that textual variants existed in the manuscript tradition, and they were not afraid to point that out. They put them in the footnotes, and I wish that the King James Bible today was still printed with the original footnotes that it had in 1611, because if it were, it would be the death blow to King James onlyism, because the King James translators themselves acknowledged that there were different words that could possibly be the correct words in the manuscript tradition. The King James translators did not think they were inspired. They did not think they were making the perfect translation. Had they thought they were making the perfect translation, they wouldn't have added notes like these. And these are just a few examples. There are more than this. And here's a quote. The quote coming out of Hampton Court. This is in the preface to the reader. The King James translators wrote this. Some, peradventure, would have no variety of sense to be set in the margin, lest the authority of Scripture for deciding controversies by that show of uncertainty should somewhat be shaken. But we hold their judgment not to be sound in this. What does that mean? It's Old English, so it's slightly difficult to understand. But they're saying, some people are saying you shouldn't have marginal notes, because if you have marginal notes, then if you have a controversial text, you may not be able to come to a conclusion on it, because some people might appeal to the footnote, some people might appeal to the text that's in the body of the text. And the King James translators are saying, no, we are being completely transparent with this. We want people to understand this, and it's not something that they're trying to hide from. They were perfectly honest with the work that they were doing. This is a quote from Dan Wallace, and I really think that it sums it up. He says this: to get people who don't know Greek to say that the King James Bible is the only inspired text, the ignorance is so profound it is simply sad to see. And I think that there is a degree to which there is an anti-historical bent towards King James onlyism, where they don't want to look to these true facts that exist. The King James Bible, the translators knew there were textual variants. They were using the 7 editions of the TR, which came from Erasmus, Beza, and Stephanus. None of them thought that their works were perfect. None of them even compile what's known as the TR today. So what is the TR today? What do King James only advocates refer to when they talk about the TR? When a King James only advocate refers to the TR, typically what they're talking about is not one of those 7 editions that was used in the translation of the King James Bible. What they're talking about is Scrivener's Textus Receptus. Okay, so how does this work? Now, I put this graph on the screen, and hopefully this will help you understand, because just using words on this, it always gets so muddled. It's so hard to explain. So, the King James Bible was translated from the 7 TRs. Years later, Frederick Henry Ambrose Scrivener took the King James Bible and with it, next to the 7 TRs, determined which TR had been used for the specific reading in every verse in the Bible. Why does he have a motivation to do this? Well, he wants a Greek text. He's not King James only, by the way. He just wants a Greek text that matches the King James Bible. And so he takes whatever verse the King James translators translated from, and he uses that, and he compiles all of those into his own edition of the TR. So based off the decisions the King James translators made and which TR they used, that was the version that he put into the final Textus Receptus, or maybe I shouldn't say final Textus Receptus, but the Textus Receptus that most people use today, if they use the Textus Receptus. And so this blue-bound TR is a Greek version that was based off an English version that came from 7 Greek versions. So the Textus Receptus, as it exists today, was based off the King James Bible. It wasn't the translation, there was no wording differences that were made, but the actual texts that were chosen from the original 7 were pulled based on which version the King James translators used in the 1611 King James. I know that's a little bit confusing, but I hope that makes sense, that it was Scrivener's decision to compile all 7 of those into one book, and that one book was based off of the decisions that the King James translators had made in 1611. So the King James Bible, yes, it was translated from I should say ATR, TRs, plural, Textus Recepti, if you want to say it like that. But to say the King James was translated from the Textus Receptus doesn't quite paint the full picture. It's not a clear picture of what exactly was going on, because they were called the Textus Receptus, but they were multiple. As people know the Textus Receptus today in this blue-bound book, this was actually based upon the 1611 King James. The 1611 was not translated from the Textus Receptus. And that leads us to the 1769 King James Bible. So what is this? Because a lot of times you'll hear King James only advocates say, 1611, we love the 1611 King James Bible. Well, first off, the 1611 King James Bible had footnotes. Secondly, it contained the Apocrypha, which I should also throw in there, which no Protestant accepts the Apocrypha as canonical. So there's obviously a problem there. You can say, well, they didn't think it was inspired, but it was still in there. It was bound between the covers. But nobody reads the 1611 King James Bible today. If you have a facsimile copy of the 1611 King James, you will see how incredibly difficult it is for you to read. If you're reading a King James Bible today, you are reading a 1769 revision. So what is the 1769 revision? In 1769, a revision was made of the King James Version, in which many spellings and printings were updated. 2 editions of this revision were created, along with spelling updates. There were several wording differences between them. So you have an Oxford edition of the 1769 update, and you have a Cambridge version. Both are in print today. And there are differences between these two. I have some illustrations there on the screen in Jeremiah 34. Whom he had set at liberty versus whom ye had set at liberty. There's a difference there. Ye and he do not mean the same thing. 2 Chronicles, and all his sins and his trespasses, and in the Cambridge edition it says, and all his sin, singular, as opposed to plural, in Oxford. And then in Oxford in 2 Timothy 2, heard of me among many witnesses, and then the Cambridge edition, heard of me from many witnesses. There's a difference between hearing from people and hearing among people. And so you can say, oh, these differences, these are so minor. These are such tiny little differences. And you're correct. They are small differences. However, if your standard is perfection, which the King James only crowd maintains, that the Bible must be perfect word for word, then you have a problem here. These are not word perfect. If one of them differs, how do you determine which one is correct? Well, any rational person would say you have to check it with the Greek and Hebrew texts, and whichever one is closer to the Greek or Hebrew text is accurate. However, if you're King James only, I'm not sure how you come to that conclusion, because your 1611 Bible is the authority. So this is a problem for King James only advocates. And once again, this isn't a bash on the King James Version. I don't want anyone to think that I'm opposed to the King James Version. I just want to give it its proper place in history. It's a historical document. I think it would be a disservice to the King James Bible to not give it its proper place in history. And I'd like to also consider the critical text before we get into specific textual variants in the King James Bible itself that are problematic. So the critical text, or the Nestle-Aland or UBS text, this is the text that Bibles are translated from today. Almost universally, Bibles are translated from the UBS or Nestle-Aland text. And this text, as opposed to the Textus Receptus, which used 7 to 12 manuscripts to compile it, the critical text uses all the available manuscript data, and then all the available manuscript data has the principles of textual criticism applied to it, and then those are printed into a Greek text. And in the Nestle-Aland text, there are also alternate readings in the margins, which means in your Nestle-Aland text, any variant that is meaningful and viable will either appear in the text itself or in the margin, which means all the readings are there. And then all of your modern Bible translations, I shouldn't say all, because that's technically not true, but most of your modern Bible translations, NIV, ESV, NASB, NET, LSB, etc., are translated from the critical text. So you have the Textus Receptus, which underlies the King James Bible, which has 7 to 12 manuscripts from the 10th century onward. That's probably actually even a little bit earlier. And then you have the critical text, which is what we use today, which takes all of the manuscript data, all 6,000-ish manuscripts, and compiles them using our principles of textual criticism, both the TR and the Nestle Aland use textual criticism, and we come up with the best possible readings. So those are the differences in the underlying Greek text between the King James Bible and the modern translations. And now I'd like to look at some textual variants between the Nestle Aland text and the Textus Receptus. And all of these variants are differences that made it into the King James Bible and are still in the King James Bible to this day. I'd like to show you some of the manuscript evidence behind them. This one specifically, Revelation 22:19, has always been the most fascinating one to me. So you remember that Erasmus was translating, or he was compiling his Greek text, the Textus Receptus, from the 7 manuscripts that he had. Well, he only had one manuscript for the book of Revelation. In fact, it was a commentary. He expected Basel, Switzerland would have tons of Greek manuscripts, but he wasn't able to find many for the book of Revelation. And so, when he comes to the book of Revelation, in his commentary, the last page of the commentary has actually fallen out, which means he has no Greek underlying text to put in his Textus Receptus. It doesn't exist for him. And he's in a rush. So what do you do when you're in a rush to get this thing to print and you have nothing to put in for the last 6 verses of the Bible? Revelation 22:16 through 21, he had no manuscript evidence for. He had no support for it. So what do? Well, I'll tell you what Erasmus did. He back-translated from his own Latin into Greek. Do you understand that? He took his Latin translation and said, how would this be said in Greek? And he translated it into Greek. And inevitably, as you expect, he created a few variants that had never been seen anywhere in the history of Christendom up until Erasmus did this. He's translating from Latin into Greek. Who translates from a different language back into the original language, trying to get the original wording of the original language? He would have never done this had he not been in such a rush. And, Erasmus made this textual variant right here in Revelation 22:19. You see, God shall take away his part out of the book of life. That's Erasmus. All of the other versions, God will take away his share in the tree of life. Erasmus has Book of Life. Every manuscript on the planet until Erasmus back-translated into Latin said Tree of Life. But due to the fact that Erasmus put Book of Life, that reading is still in the King James Bible to this day. And Erasmus gave an explanation as to why he did this. Here's a somewhat lengthy quote, but he tells you in his annotations what he's doing here. He's not trying to deceive anyone. He's not under a delusion that he is making some perfect, infallible Bible. This is Erasmus. There was no doubt that some things were missing, and it was not much. Therefore, we completed our Greek text from our Latin text, so that there might be no gap. We did not want to hide this from the reader, however, and acknowledged in the annotations what we had done in order that if our words differ in some respect from those that the author of this work had provided, the reader would have obtained a manuscript, may be able to restore them. And even this that we did here, we would not have dared to do in the case of the Gospels, nor would we have dared to do so in the apostolic epistles. The style of this book, speaking of Revelation, is very simple, and its contents are mostly narrative, let alone the fact that the author has long since been unknown. Finally, this place is only the ending of the book. Listen to what Erasmus just said. He doesn't care. It's not a big deal to him. He doesn't even think Revelation is canonical, or at least from this quote, he doesn't seem to value it. He says, we wouldn't have done this in the Gospels or the epistles. But right here, who really cares? It's just the book of Revelation. It's confusing. Nobody really understands it. He admitted that there was an error in here. And you want to know furthermore, there was another text coming out. And he told the Aldine text to fix his edition. And so he said, go get, there was another text coming out, and Erasmus said, fix my translation of Revelation, or fix my Greek text of Revelation with the Aldine text. Take it, change my errors, make them better, because obviously there were some errors in my text. What he didn't realize is the Aldine text had used his first edition, which means as they were going to check his work, they realized, wait, this is exactly the same. So there was nothing to fix. It was exactly the same, which means that even though Erasmus specifically wanted this reading changed and fixed, it didn't get done, and Erasmus somehow never looked at it. And this is now the reading in the King James Bible to this day. And if you're a King James only advocate, you have to maintain that book is the proper reading, not tree, even though this reading did not exist until Erasmus back-translated it into into Greek from Latin. It's just preposterous. It's not tenable. It's not even possible that that's a possibility. And this leads us to the next textual variant. This one, to me, might be even worse than the last one, although I find the last one more interesting. Revelation 16:5. The difference in textual variant. The ESV reads, "Just art you, O Holy One, who is and who was." The King James reads, "O Lord, which art and wast and shall be." So you can see I've put in red the textual variant. You have O Holy One, which is Hagios, versus and shall be, which is Asamenos. So where did this Asamenos come from? Asamenos is a conjectural emendation. Theodore Beza made a conjectural emendation. What is a conjectural emendation? It is when somebody guesses, essentially. It's an educated guess at what the wording should be. He is conjecturing on this, and he is editing the text. Although all of the manuscripts say, O Holy One, in this place, he puts Asamenos, which is and shall be, simply because, I guess I don't want to speculate as to why he did this, but you can see just by the construction of the words there, you could see how you could logically deduce that maybe it should be and shall be. The problem is there's not a single Greek manuscript that reads and shall be. So if you're going to claim that and shall be is the original wording, then Theodore Beza had to have been inspired against all of the manuscripts that exist today to incorporate this into the King James Bible, into the Textus Receptus. And this is the version that was used to translate the King James Bible. And so it is in there, and it didn't exist until Theodore Beza added it into his edition. Once again, this is a variant that has no manuscript evidence to support it whatsoever, because it didn't exist until a man invented the reading. Once again, I don't want this to be taken as a criticism of the King James Bible. I love the King James Bible, but I do want to give it its proper place in history. It's not an ahistorical document. So these are just some of the things we have to deal with. These are the facts of the matter. And this leads us to 1 John 5:7. And this may be one of the most controversial textual variants between the King James Bible and all of the modern translations. 1 John 5:7. For there are three that bear record in heaven. This is in the King James Version. The Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. Whereas in the modern translations, it reads, for there are three that testify. So there's a big textual variant there. So what's going on? Erasmus left this out in his first two editions. In 1516 and 1519, which were his first edition and his second edition, Erasmus didn't include this Trinitarian formula. And he came under fire. People threw a fit. They were like, you have to put this in. Accusations of Arianism, you're a heretic, you don't believe in the Trinity. And Erasmus wasn't trying to change anything. He wasn't trying to impact doctrine. He simply didn't have this verse in there because he didn't have any Greek manuscript support for it. It didn't exist. This was a reading that was in the Latin Vulgate, but it wasn't in any of the Greek manuscripts. So what is he to do? He's not trying to trick anyone. He's not trying to change doctrine. He just doesn't have the manuscript evidence. And so he actually, as he comes under fire, he actually asks one of his friends to check Codex Vaticanus. He says, can you check the Vatican manuscript and see if at 1 John 5:7 this Trinitarian formula isn't there? And it wasn't there. Erasmus couldn't get to Vaticanus. He couldn't use Vaticanus, though he would have loved to use Vaticanus. What is Codex Vaticanus? Well, Lord willing, we'll discuss that in the next lesson. That is a highly incredible manuscript Erasmus would have loved to use. But he comes under fire. Erasmus, why isn't this text there? And so Erasmus essentially says, look, I don't have any problem putting this in. I simply don't have a Greek manuscript that has this in there. What do you want me to do? Make up the reading? And so in 1522, Erasmus' third edition, he added this Trinitarian formula because out of the nowhere, Codex Montfortianus showed up on Erasmus' doorstep. Codex Montfortianus was written by a man named Roy, who intentionally made this to give Erasmus Greek manuscript support to put it in. Erasmus noted in his annotations that he didn't even think that this reading was original, but due to the fact that somebody literally hand-wrote a manuscript specifically for the purpose of pressuring Erasmus into putting this into his third edition of his TR. And you have to keep in mind, down in Germany, Luther has already made his Bible translation, which means the German Bible doesn't have this Trinitarian formula in this. There hasn't been any of the controversy in the German Bible due to the fact that this Trinitarian formula didn't exist in the first two editions of the TR, and that's what Luther was using to translate his German version. The Germans didn't have any problem being Trinitarians, so our faith in the Trinity isn't based upon 1 John 5:7. Our faith in the Trinity is based on the testimony of the New Testament. You have all of the places where the Holy Spirit is called God, all the places where Jesus is called God, and obviously all the places where the Father is called God, but then you have the truth that there's a distinction between the persons. And you also have verses like the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things. So you have all three of them there. You have Jesus' baptism, where the Holy Spirit descends on Jesus as a dove, and the Father speaks, "This is my beloved Son, whom I love, with him I'm well pleased." So that's how we deduce the Trinity. It's through the testimony of Scripture. It's not from a proof text like this. And so to appeal to this text in that way is not accurate, because this text is clearly not original. There is no serious textual critical scholar in the world who thinks this text is original. So what is the manuscript evidence for this text? Obviously, Erasmus said that it's not original. 4 16th century Greek manuscripts have this text in there. 4 16th century Greek manuscripts. You also have 4 12th century Greek manuscripts that in the margin with a 16th or 17th century hand this is written. So altogether you have 8. You have 8 manuscripts. 4 of them are written in the margin, which is clearly wasn't there originally, and 4 of them are in the text, but those are all from the 16th century. Which means there's also no early church father who cites to this verse during any of the Trinitarian controversies in the early church. There was no citation of this verse. This verse is not original. It was added to the Bible. And so Erasmus came under fire. Erasmus added it to the TR, and it is in the Bible, the King James Bible, to this day. The manuscript material, every manuscript, apart from these 8, does not have this reading in there. And you have to remember that these manuscripts are coming from the 16th century. This would be an illustration of a reading that is meaningful, but is not viable. It is not viable that it goes back to the original autograph. And this leads us to the last variant that I would like to look at today. And there are more. These are just examples. These are some of the most egregious ones. Ephesians 3:9, you have oikonomia versus koinonia. The King James Version reads, "To make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery." The ESV reads, "And to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery." So you have plan versus fellowship. Fellowship is koinonia. Plan is oikonomia. Why is this in the King James Bible to this day? Well, for the first 1,000 years of church history, at least in the manuscripts that exist, there is not a single manuscript that has koinonia, which is fellowship, which is what's in the King James Bible. One manuscript that Erasmus happened to use had koinonia. 99% of all Greek manuscripts read oikonomia at Ephesians 3:9. But due to the fact that Erasmus happened to be working, one of the 7 that Erasmus was using, happened to have koinonia. He put that in the TR, and that is in the King James Bible to this day. If you want to claim that the King James has the majority text supporting it, then you have to reject the reading of fellowship at Ephesians 3:9. Ephesians 3:9 does not read fellowship in 99% of the Greek manuscripts. And that leads us to the question, well, which is better? The Textus Receptus or the Nestle-Aland text? Well, honestly, I don't even like this comparison, because to pit the Nestle-Aland against the Textus Receptus is a false dichotomy. The Nestle Aland is simply a continuing of the practice of textual criticism that has been taking place throughout the entirety of church history. The Textus Receptus is a good text. It exists in history. The Nestle Aland is the logical outgrowth, the next step in the same vein. We are now using all of the manuscript data that is available, and we are now compiling the best possible technology with the technology that we have. We have technology that Erasmus could have never even dreamed of. I heard one King James only advocate say that Erasmus compared all 6,000 Greek manuscripts and came up with his readings in the Textus Receptus. And I just wanted to say, what do you think Erasmus was? He was not a computer. He was a brilliant scholar, but he was not a computer. He didn't have the ability to do that. So I don't like pitting these two against each other. But I do believe that the Nestle Aland text is the obvious outgrowth in the same vein, and it is the superior text between these two. But once again, I don't like pitting them against each other because the Textus Receptus is not my enemy. God has used the Textus Receptus mightily. But one thing I can tell you is if you were to tell Erasmus that we were still using his Greek text of the book of Revelation as our only inspired Bible, Erasmus would be flabbergasted. You know what? He would also think we were morons. He would say, what on earth are you guys doing? In fact, if you were to tell the King James translators that in light of all of the new discoveries that we have in manuscripts, and all of the technology that we have, and all of the ability we have to make new translations, if you were to tell them that we were still using their translation from 1611, they would be disgusted with us. They would not appreciate that. A good illustration I heard, I think this came from Mark Ward, he said, it would be like if a missionary went to Africa and planted 20 churches and then died. And we said, well, in order to honor that missionary, we can never plant more than the original 20 that he originally planted. We can only work with those ones. Well, if you're going to truthfully honor that missionary, you're going to continue his work of planting more and more churches. And I think that's kind of what goes on with the Textus Receptus. People think if we're going to honor the King James translators, then we have to use their work. Well, we are reliant on their work, but if you were to tell them that we have not made any further steps with all of the new discoveries and all of our new ability, they would not think we were doing a good job. Unless you think that this topic is too esoteric to follow, the footnotes exist. You can easily buy an NET Bible if you want, and you can examine the manuscripts for yourself. They are online. You say, I can't read Greek. You know, you can learn Greek, but what I'm thankful for is the fact that there have been so many brilliant scholars who have done this work for us. They have poured their lives into these topics. It's things that have to be done. But they are very transparent with the material. They're not trying to hide anything. Nothing is being done behind closed doors. They're completely transparent with what they're doing. And one thing that I'd like to read from the King James translators, this comes from the preface. They say this: neither did we think much to consult the translators or the commentators, Chaldee, Hebrew, Syrian, Greek, or Latin. No, nor the French, Spanish, Italian, or Dutch. Neither did we disdain to revise that which we had done, and to bring back to the anvil that which we had hammered. Meaning, if we thought that there was a better way of translating it, we would translate it better. They continue. But having and using as great helps as were needful, and fearing no reproach for slowness, nor coveting praise for for expedition, we have at length, through the good hand of the Lord upon us, brought the work to pass that you see. And so the King James translators did work, and if they thought that it could be improved upon, they'd bring it back and they would improve upon it. They were brilliant scholars. I have the utmost respect for them. I love the work they did. God has used it mightily. But it was not the be-all, end-all. It is not the only Bible that can be used. And to make that claim is to just ignore the historicity of the document itself. And one thing that I'd like to mention before we go to the concluding slide. We've talked a lot about textual variants, but I'd like to be clear. This is a quote from Dan Wallace. No essential doctrine of the Christian faith is jeopardized by any textual variant. There is no doctrine that is jeopardized by any meaningful and viable variant, which means even in the most different of manuscripts, you still have the same Christian faith. There are no wholesale changes. We might not like the fact that variants exist, because it means we have to do more work, we have to do more study. But our faith is not shaken. The Reformers had the Textus Receptus. We used the Nestle Aland, and we have the same faith. The differences that we might have with the Reformers come from largely interpretational differences, not textual differences. That's vital to understand. It's not a textual difference. It's a interpretational difference. Just as Baptists, we have differences with the Presbyterians. And the Presbyterians have differences with the Lutherans. These are interpretational differences, not textual differences. And so with that, we move on to the final slide. God has preserved His Word in the original languages in such a way that it can never be changed. His Word exists in the manuscript tradition. The manuscript tradition was never under the control of a governing authority that had the ability to change it. We can be confident that we still have everything the apostles wrote. Because they love the Word of God, faithful men have dedicated their lives to determining every variant, including the most insignificant of variants, even down to the precise spelling of words. And so with that, we'll conclude the lecture for today. I hope that this has given you at least somewhat of an understanding. All of these topics could be expounded upon so much further. But just a general understanding of the history of the Bible in English, and an appreciation for what God has done. God has worked through the Textus Receptus, and God has brought us a phenomenal text, the Nestle Aland text now. And we are thankful. We are thankful to the men who have dedicated their lives to giving us the best possible text we can have. And we are thankful that God has used them in this way. And with that, we conclude this lesson, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for the lesson coming up.